Howdy, I'm Jammer. So I remember when I was in grade school, my middle school art teacher, who was still relatively new, and I think she only lasted about a year because I honestly can't even remember her face or her name. But I do remember she took the time to give us all a sheet of white paper, and she told us to stare at it for a few seconds. Then she also gave us a piece of red construction paper. She's like, okay, stare at the red construction paper for about a minute. So we all just sat there and stared at the color. Or at least I did. Everybody else was probably fading in or out. But immediately at the end of about 30 seconds, she says, okay, now move away the red construction paper and stare at the white paper. And we all did. And you knew something had happened because immediately at that moment, every kid in the class went, whoa! Because what happens is staring at a particular color and then staring at white, which again, as I noted in a previous video, is virtually every color, what happens is kind of an optical illusion. Staring at the white paper, a solid square of green began to appear. And the same effect happened when we looked at purple, or when we looked at orange, or when we looked at yellow. Basically, what would happen is we looked at one color, and when we looked at white, the sort of alternative or contrasting color appeared to our eyes. And that was crazy to me at that age. Because even though I had been really involved with art, and art was one of my favorite classes, and even though my house was literally filled with art history books, and my mom actually tutored art history, I had never made that connection, or I had never really seen anybody, or really seen an exercise which really impacted in me how important color was to my perception of things. I'm not going to say from that moment I began to pay far more attention to color than I did, because I didn't. I went about my life the same way everybody else did, which was basically trying to survive grade school and get out of that nightmare. But then, years after the fact, when I started drawing again, when I started employing color in my drawings, I really began to observe how powerful color can impact our consciousness. And again, if you don't believe that color is important, just think about the three colors that are behind me during every single video. There are people that, when these colors are arranged on this rectangle in this particular pattern, will lose their mind over it, because to them, it embodies the sum total of their identity. It is God, beauty, and truth made manifest. Colors matter terribly. And not just in terms of our appreciation of art, but in terms of our day-to-day reality, how we perceive things. If I was sitting here with just my hair, I may not make such an impact upon you, the viewer. My hair being all over the place would be the experience. Placing this hat on my head, however, creates a new sensation to you. Likewise, sitting here and staring at the cover of Matter of Life by Jeffrey Brown, you see the red of the letters, you see the brown of the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Now, what does all this have to do with anything? What does this have to do with comics? Well, we'll be resuming Understanding Comics today, and we're down to the last two chapters. There is Chapter 8, which is literally, Chapter 8, a word about color. And then finally there's the last summation chapter. We're almost done with this book, and when we are, I don't know what I'm going to do next. I've thought about hopping into Y Comics, I believe, by Wendy Davis. I probably got her name wrong. I've thought about doing that, or maybe just hopping into another really long graphic novel and tackling that chapter by chapter. I don't know. For the time being, we're almost done with Understanding Comics, and today's video will hopefully be pretty short, because Chapter 8 is relatively short, and when I mean Chapter 8, it's almost that. It's almost about 8 pages long. So I could almost just read this chapter out to you, and you'd get the very gist of it. Nevertheless, this is an important chapter to discuss, because even if it's not terribly long, it still demonstrates Scott McCloud sort of examining a really crucial aspect of comics, which is how color can impact color as opposed to color. Can you tell? I grew up watching Monty Python. Ugh. Can you tell? Excuse me. Color matters in comics, because comics has such a unique history with color, and particularly the commercial enterprise of comics has such a unique history of color. But then also we have to consider the fact that Scott McCloud is arguing that comics is an art form. Therefore, we need to see how color works in this medium and why it's so bloody important. Alright, Now, in terms of just the content of Chapter 8, there's really not much to it. Scott McCloud basically just goes through and observes just the history of how color was employed within the comics medium, and then ultimately the ways that color effect would affect the production of comics, how it would influence artists who saw the role of color in comics, and then ultimately how creators of comics and even just appreciators of comics have to understand how color needs to be interpreted in the artwork. Because there are going to be some artists that are going to prioritize colors over others, and then there are going to be some artists that don't even bother with colors at all. And I'll provide a couple of examples of those here in just a minute. But for the time being, what's really important, or really want to start with, is just his opening sort of paragraph here. I'll pause it real quick so you can read it for yourself. Pausing, waiting. Okay. You're done. You've read it already, but I'm going to read it out loud because it's interesting. Throughout art history, color has been a powerful, even predominant concern in fine artists everywhere. Some, like Georges Seurat, devoted their lives to study. Again, you'll note Georges Seurat was a man who focused a lot on impressionism, minimalism, and pointillism. Effectively, the artist is doing a point of color over and over again. My grade school teacher had us paint using those things you stick in your ears to get earwax out of. Oh my God. I'll find it later and I'll put it in the description section. Anyway, Georges Seurat was a really important painter because he experimented with pointillism and showed how single units of color can create an overall experience. And then as he notes, others like Kandinsky believe that colors could have profound physical and emotional effects on people. If you've never seen a Kandinsky, just Google image search Kandinsky. You'll probably recognize the man's work. It's very abstract and tends to be very experimental in terms of the arrangement of color. Yet in comics, the career of color has been, well, spotty. There are many reasons for the stormy relationship between comics and color, but most can be summed up in two words: commerce and technology. So one of the interesting things immediately about Chapter 8 is it employs color. That's, again, one of the really beautiful aesthetic effects of understanding comics is up to this point, the entire book has been printed and constructed using only black and white images. Scott McCloud has stayed with black and white, but now he employs color to bring attention to color and then also demonstrate how color can impact the aesthetic experience of the reader. Do you see what he's doing? He's kind of doing the thing by doing the thing. It's that damn meta concept again. He's using color to talk about color. And so in just this panel alone, commerce and technology, he uses color as a means of separating his point and really emphasizing his argument. Now again, you'll see various instances here of color wheels and color patterns, and he's trying to really here talk a little bit about how color came about. The technology of color reproduction was first anticipated in 1861 when Scottish physicist Sir James Clerk Maxwell isolated what we now call the three additive primaries. These colors, roughly red, blue, and green, when projected together on a screen in various combinations, could reproduce every color in the visible spectrum, aka white. If you arrange these three additive colors together, you'll eventually get every single color. But that's if we're talking about light, pure light. Color on the page is ink, and ink is going to have different properties. 8 years later, French pianist Louis Ducos d'Oron devised the idea of three subtractive primaries. These colors, cyan, magenta, and yellow, can also mix to produce any hue in the visible spectrum, but rather than adding light, these three do it by filtering it out. Thus, subtractive effect was achieved through transparent substances such as cellophane, colored glass, watercolors, or printer's ink. Again, I'm pointing these pages and these panels out to demonstrate that Chapter 8 focuses a lot on history and how commerce and technology have impacted the production of color in printing. This has relevance not just to the field of comics, but as he points down here, other aspects of print media as well. Most people are familiar with comics because of newspapers. Now again, print media is kind of in an uncertain place right now. There's a lot of people who are predicting the total end of print media. There are some people who are steadfastly willing to die on the hill that no newspapers will endure. I'm not here to be a soothsayer. All I know is that the role of comics in the newspaper is something that's probably going to change as more and more newspapers have to reconsider the costs of column space and then prioritizing certain elements in the paper over others, and then the cost of advertising, whether or not they actually get some or whether or not they have next to nothing. Because cartoonists need money, and if they're not going to get it from the newspaper, they're going to go somewhere else. Regardless, as he points out, newspapers were one of the primary spaces for consumers of comics, and when color entered the newspaper market, it blew up. Because at that moment, the funny pages effectively became a staple within the culture. Sunday especially was always noteworthy in this country because you get the Sunday newspaper. It's usually really bigger, it's got extra sections, it's got tons of coupons for grandma to clip, and then for the kids, or far more often adults really, you would have 3, maybe 6 pages of comics that would not just be 3 or 4 panel strips with a keg, they would be full pages filled with colors. So Dagwood and Blondie, Garfield, Calvin and Hobbes, Bloom County, Mutts, what have you, those characters would no longer be empty black and white. They would suddenly be filled with color. They would have more space to interact in. Jokes could be more exploratory. Or in the case of comics like Calvin and Hobbes, you would get really interesting panel layouts that would tell really interesting stories that might end in a joke, or as far more often was the case with Calvin and Hobbes, end with a beautiful philosophical statement about humanity. Regardless, color impacted the media to a tremendous amount, predominantly because people began to realize, ooh, wait a minute, if we make magazines with color filled with comics, we might try to do something a little bit different. Scott McCloud points out one of the reasons why a lot of the early superheroes tended to be very iconic was because color costs a lot of money, and comics didn't always make a lot of money. Again, it's just comics. Therefore, a lot of the early superhero comic books are predominantly going to be based off of very basic color schemes. The colors were picked for strength and contrasted strongly with one another, but on most pages, no one color dominated. Without the emotional impact of a single color saturation, the expressive potential of American color comics was often canceled out to an emotional gray. As always, there were some exceptions, but this was the overall trend. However, while comic colors were less than expressionistic, they were fixed with a new iconic power because costume colors remained exactly the same. Panel after panel, they came to symbolize the characters in the mind of the reader. So as technology developed and more colors came into effect, creators of comics had to become more creative in order to really understand and, more importantly, develop commercially the characters that they were selling. As he demonstrated there, you can't picture the Incredible Hulk without picturing green body, purple pants. You can't picture Batman without blue suit, yellow utility belt, gray pants. Or really, blue cape, gray armor and pants, and then the yellow utility belt. Superman, blue and red. It's just there. Flash, red and yellow. Colors become the way to sort of create the character as much as the actual iconic drawing of said character. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about, or at least Scott McCloud has talked a little bit about color in comics. Why don't we take a quick look at a couple of examples of it to really observe how some artists have employed colors in particular ways. All right, so we talked a little bit about color and how color can have particular aesthetic effects upon the viewer. And again, when I'm talking about aesthetic effects, it's sort of the idea that the arrangement of certain elements can create some kind of effect in the viewer, whether it's sort of nostalgia, feelings of seduction or awareness, sometimes feelings of anger, perceptions of anger, excitement, what have you. There's a lot of different ways that color can affect us personally, and there's a lot of thinking behind this, and a lot of that thinking and execution has really come to play in a lot of comics. For example, if we take a look at Swamp Thing by Alan Moore and Steve Bissette, there's a lot of really beautiful and interesting color choices made within this comic book. if you look at just this small passage here, when Abby is sort of initially being confronted by her uncle Anton Arcane, we see how the yellow and the red is contrasting together. The yellow giving us this feeling of sort of corruption and tension, the red also sort of creating this feeling of muscle, meat, vulnerability. But perhaps one of the best examples is the last closing chapter of this book, where Abby essentially eats or consumes part of Swamp Thing, and the pair of them effectively go on an acid trip together. There's a beautiful sequence of pages where we get this absolutely radiant acid trip, and you can see how these colors are affecting the reader as they go along this trip with Abby. Looking at just the larva, or the picture of Swamp Thing himself, or just the perception of the planet, these colors all sort of just assault the reader so that one is left kind of mystified and overwhelmed, but at the same time, just left with a feeling of the sublime. Again, Alan Moore was trying to give you an acid trip in a comic book, and because of the colors in that book, it works magnificently well. Now, an early book we covered in this channel was Eastman and Laird's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Again, this is a reprint of the original comics, but it's important to realize when this book originally came out, or when the comics were coming out, they were black and white. However, what's unique about these comics is today they're in color. This is actually a pretty common trick, and there's actually a recently colorized version of From Hell by Alan Moore. But seeing the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles interacting with all of this color gives a new energy to the book itself. Moments become far more powerful, not simply because of the visuals being presented, but also because of the colors that we're representing. And again, especially if we get into the idea of colors becoming characters into themselves, with the later renditions of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, they would introduce different color bandanas. You would be able to tell the difference between Michelangelo and Leonardo and Donatello because each one of them would have a different color bandana over their face. Another really interesting use of color, I would definitely recommend Batman Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth by Grant Morrison and Dave McKean. This is one of my favorite comic books of all time. It was one of the earliest graphic novels I ever actually got my hands on, and it is a beautiful meditation on insanity, psychosis, and strength of will. That's its own video for itself. But what's unique about this book is if you've ever seen any of Dave McKean's artwork, you know that the man is, one, really likes multimedia, but he also has no real filter when it comes to his expression. His pages are stunningly gorgeous. And while I do feel compelled to show you images of the Joker, one of the most interesting passages in the book is one that still sort of eludes me personally, which is the appearance of Maxie Zeus. Maxie Zeus was kind of a side, sort of throwaway villain in the Batman universe. He was a man who basically believed himself to be the Greek god Zeus, but he appears in this book kind of as this figure connected directly to electricity, and you can see how the blue impacts the reader. Where before we've mostly just gotten a lot of greens and darks and gray, Maxie Zeus just bursts to life with this cool electronic blue that leaves the reader with a real sense of calm, but tension at the same time. Now, I don't want it to seem that color is the sole means of demonstrating or creating an effect upon the viewer. If one looks at, say, Prisoner from Hell Planet by Art Spiegelman, we can observe sometimes how the lack of color can still be a very strong aesthetic choice. If we look here during the announcement by the doctor that your mother is dead, she committed suicide, this whole comic is shown predominantly, actually entirely, in black and white. In fact, most of Art Spiegelman's early works are in black and white. That's because, again, he was part of the underground comic scene. He didn't have a major production team behind him. He had basically an inkwell, a page of paper, and his own imagination. Nevertheless, you can still see there, even in the absence of color, there's still the possibility for an aesthetic goal. So really what I'm just trying to convey to you here is more or less what Scott McCloud has been trying to explain to you. Steve, Scott, is there really such a difference? Yes, there is. What's important is that when people make comics, if they decide to include color in said comics, we have to recognize that the employment of color can have a real powerful effect upon the reader. And McCloud sort of elaborates further upon this just a little bit more in his book. I know you can't see it, but I'm kind of sweating like crazy right now because it's Texas in May and I had to turn off my AC because otherwise it makes this like humming noise in the background and it really ruins the audio quality, such as it is. So if I start to wipe my head a little bit more, I promise it's not because I'm nervous. I mean, I am. I'm always nervous, but it's because it's hot, yo. So let's wrap this up. Now, we talked a little bit about the iconic nature of color, but as he points out, one of the other aspects of color that we really need to perceive is the way how it can bring attention to shapes and elements within the books. He points out these colors objectify their subjects. We become more aware of the physical form of objects than in black and white. A game in motion becomes a ball in air, a face showing emotion becomes a head and two hands. The world takes on the childhood reality of the playground and recalls a time when shape preceded meaning. Oblong swing sets, cylindrical jungle gyms, the wonder of things. Doesn't it follow then that the masters of flat color comics are, above all, masters of form and composition? And then he offers a couple of examples. So looking at this page, when he talks about the notion that color can impact the experience, he provides a really good example by showing you the same two-panel comic, one in color and one in black and white. I can't tell the difference. At least I think I can. But you can observe, hopefully just by staring at it, how profound an impact that can be. You obviously recognize that this is supposed to be a game of softball. Volleyball. Nerd. No, it should be nerd. I'm talking to me. They're playing volleyball. I've never played sports, can you tell? They're playing volleyball, and you can see that in the black and white, but the way color impacts the viewer at that moment is it presents a new real sense of realness and depth to the experience. You perceive far more of the ball and of the face in color than you did when it was in black and white. And then, like I said, he provides a couple of examples of important comics artists. Jack Kirby's probably one of the best ones that I can point to here. However, I will tell you that if you have never seen the work, he doesn't show the artist Mobius, but I guarantee you that I will make sure to do a Mobius comic, because if you haven't read him, oh my god, he's beautiful. Like, I could just do a whole series on Mobius himself. Ideas for the future. Whatever the case, it's important to recognize that Scott McCloud is trying to show that the introduction of color had real importance and significance to comics creators. As he points, suddenly it seemed possible for color to take on a central role. Colors could express a dominant mood, tones and modeling could add depth, whole scenes could be virtually about color. Color as sensation, color as environment, color as color. And as he sort of continues, well, let me show you just the passage I read from down below. Looking at that just four-panel arrangement, you can see how, again, the different small choices in the representations of color can create real impact upon the viewer. Whether it's the choice of employing colored pencils and using softer tones, using more dynamic sort of primary color spectrums, will ultimately impact how you, the viewer, are going to experience the comic. And then as he points out here, the introduction of more color options ultimately impacted a lot of this aspect of the industry, because where before in the early days there was a lot more attention paid towards primary colors because it was cheap and easy, introducing new colors included new depth that at times was jarring, and a lot of resistance was actually met. Now, there are some people that feel that absolutely artists should have access to a whole range of colors. There's some artists who feel completely content in black and white, and as he points out, unfortunately, color is still an expensive option and has historically been in the hands of larger, more conservative publishers. Now, it's important, especially in this current political climate, let's call it that, to recognize what he means by conservative. Conservative here is not meant to be political conservatism, it's more the economic conservatism of it. DC is a pretty conservative publishing company. They're going to put out a Superman book, and they're going to monitor just about every aspect of that Superman book to make sure readers know, hey, this is a Superman book. I know more or less what I'm going to get. I know what colors I'm going to get. We're not going to experiment too much with this character. That is kind of a conservative market. Small independent publishers didn't have the same amount of resources because the creative choices they were making tended to be a bit more experimental. As such, they didn't make near as much money, which means a lot of those artists didn't get as much opportunities to sort of play with color. It doesn't mean that they couldn't play with color if they wanted to. It's just that a lot of times they had to rely on the black and white because that's what was cheap, that's what was available. And then finally, just one last little passage here that I wanted to read, and then pretty much we'll be done here. As he notes, the difference between black and white and color in comics are vast and profound, affecting every level of the reading experience. In black and white, the ideas behind the art are communicated more directly, meaning transcending form. Art approaches language. In flat colors, forms themselves take on more significance. The world becomes a playground of shapes and space. So really, that's all we really need to sort of end on in terms of color, and I'm just going to sort of hold on this 4-panel structure so you can read it for yourself and appreciate how each aspect of his ideas are being presented. Again, what's really great about understanding comics is every panel is presented to sort of continue the thesis of the book itself. Every panel has a purpose, every panel has an argument to make, and again, he uses black and white to express how black and white is used to express ideas, while color is employed to demonstrate nuance and energy. Again, here we get kind of just the ideas, where with color we get more of a sense of the form. This is where we get into the fun aspect of what is iconic, what is photorealistic, how does color come into play, and can more iconic works suddenly become more realistic by the introduction of color? There's a lot of questions to ask that I'm not here to answer. Again, each creator and each reader of comic has to come to their own appreciation and understanding of what role is color playing in comics. Nevertheless, we as readers of comics, we as makers of comics, need to understand, well, yes, but also take into consideration, is this color helping the book? Is it hurting the book? If I use color, am I willing to have to spend more money to get my book out there? Or at the very least, what colors am I choosing? And what effect am I trying to have on the reader? Okay, I think I'm going to end it there. Thank you again, as always, for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. As always, like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. As always as well, I'll post a link to Scott McCloud's website and his TED Talk in the description section below. If you haven't watched it at this point, seriously, take your time to just watch the TED Talk, because it's more or less a lot of what he talks about in this book, but shortened down to 10 minutes. There will be one more video about understanding comics, and maybe I will return to it in the future. If I do, it'll probably just be in a sort of supplemental category, meaning it's going to be used to sort of help another book in terms of analysis. But thank you so far for following me through this series. I promise one more will be done, and maybe sometime in the future I'll come back and return to it and do just one single video shot as a book itself. Who knows? If you would be interested in reading this book, check out your local comic book shop. I guarantee you they're probably going to have a copy of this book. If not, they can order it for you. And if they can't do that, definitely check out your local public library, because they probably have a copy of this or one of the other books that Scott McCloud has put out about comics and the comics medium. As always, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. Recommend comics for me to read or talk about, or even just tell me what you're reading and why you think it's interesting, and just talk about comics, because I want to hear your opinions about comics. If it hasn't become apparent already, I'm kind of a nerd, and I kind of like this stuff. So I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you again so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Go read some comics.